scenes of Mission Impossible 3 when they're having the dinner party, the engagement party with him and his fiancée, and he's reading the lips of the girls talking in the other room, and he's having the conversations with the people, and they're exchanging eye contact. I mean, again, in the opening moments of that film, you are immediately given the ability to get sucked into their relationship and really believe that these two are together and are deeply in love, and it carries through the whole movie. Again, I'm just as excited to see what they've done in terms of the universe and in terms of the technology, but I am as equally excited to see these relationships. And you've already seen it in some of the trailers. You look at the main full trailer, U.S. trailer, and it's been repeated in several of the TV spots, but that shot off in the distance of a spaceship taking off on Jakku, and Rey standing there working on something, looking off, and she just gives this brief sigh, and this little tiny smile pokes through, and immediately it just evokes an interpretation that you could place on there that could mean 1,000 different things. You know, bittersweet, you know, sadness, joy for whoever is taking off on there. And you know, and again, it's up to us as viewers to allow ourselves to get sucked into it. I'm such a fan of Star Wars. I open myself up and I allow myself to go and read into these TV spots. It's why I'm also, you know, the three things apart from God and my family that I love is my love of Star Wars, NASCAR, and Depeche Mode. And I've grown up on Depeche Mode. I love Depeche Mode, and I love Depeche Mode from not just a musical standpoint, but also from a lyrical standpoint. I love the songwriting of Martin Gore of that group and the way that he handles the subjects of, you know, love and religion and emotions. You know, and they're open to interpretation. And I love the feeling that I get from it. I like the vibe that I get from it. And I'm already getting that vibe from these TV spots. Again, that and I mentioned this last week, but that moment between Finn and Rey in the TV spot, "What's your name? I'm Finn." And she says, "I'm Rey." I mean, your heart just melts with the way she says that. You know, so George, you know, I don't know. You know, George, it must be difficult for George having created what he did create and having to go and step away from it and not be involved in it anymore. But that's what had to happen to Star Wars to make it better. You know, part of what made the original trilogy so great was the collaborative process, was the fact that they had to find solutions for George's ideas, and I think that brought about more of a collaborative spirit on all three of those original trilogy movies. By the time he got to the prequels, he almost had complete autonomy to do whatever he specifically wanted to do. And if you've watched any of the behind-the-scenes footage, you see him and all of these different ideas placed out on giant poster boards or model maquettes or models of spaceships, right? And obviously it was a collaborative effort because he had all these artists that were working on these things, but he was the one that had the final say, and there wasn't a lot of other input apart from people presenting ideas that only George signed off on. Whereas the original trilogy, they were limited, and George may have, you know, had the autonomy to pick what he was going to look at in terms of aesthetics, but he also was in a situation where it seemed as if, was more open to other people's ideas. And having other people direct the films was the best thing to do. When it got to the prequels, it was all George. And it's no different than me doing my radio show that I do Monday through Friday on 104.1 KQTH. I can listen to my show, and I know the shows that I like. And I've been doing radio for 19 years, and so I'm a fairly good judge of what's a good show and what's not a good show. But unless I have another ear on what I'm doing, it's still just me. And recently we hired a new operations manager who gave me one little piece of advice, and it just completely changed the way that I did the show and made it better. And I never would have thought about it. Never even would have occurred to me if it hadn't been him suggesting this to me, and if I hadn't been open to it. I could have very easily said, whatever, dude, you don't know me. I've been doing this show for 8 years here in Tucson. But you got to be open to different ideas. You've got to be collaborative. And I think that's where George got tripped up in the prequel trilogy, and why they didn't meet the expectation of so many different people, was that simply it was too much of George. And George is right. There's a part of me that wishes he was a little bit more involved. And I think they probably ended up using more. And even J.J. Abrams said as much in a couple of the articles, specifically about what George Lucas was saying this week in these interviews. He even said, look, the spirit of what George wanted was there. The spirit of what he was looking to do is there. I'm glad that somebody else has the reins. I'm glad that George was able to let it go. And I'm glad it's in the hands of fans. And, many podcasts ago, I went on a rant about how it just didn't seem like in the prequel trilogy, again, coming from somebody that likes them, it didn't seem like they understood what it was that they had at the time. And now it seems like it's in the hands of individuals that know and love this and cherish it and are trying to make something special. When George Lucas went and made the prequels, he was just continuing his story. And had he continued and not sold to Disney and made the sequel trilogy, it would have just been, well, I just want to tell my story, and I'm just going to make these movies the way I've made these movies, and, it'll be my way, and we'll just make them. And that's the wrong approach when it comes to something as special as Star Wars. And we owe George, and this is not a slam on George, it's just things need to change. George was the one that came up with the mythology. He was the genius behind taking all of these old myths and stories that have been ingrained in our minds through centuries and creating and building a completely different galaxy and world that had a grounding in reality of what we deal with on a daily basis, but again, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And again, I said it before, I'll say it again, he ruined it for any other filmmaker to go and do world building like that, because nobody's going to be able to go and do that, because George ended up taking that market of going out into conceivably our own galaxy, but creating a world completely and totally foreign to us, again, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. The closest thing to it is Lord of the Rings, right? Because there's the parallels there of Lord of the Rings being a long time ago and having it to relate to where we are now. So, okay. Now, let's move forward. Where are we at? There were some book spoilers that came out. I won't get into them except to give you a couple of points. There was a Look and Find book that came out that ended up giving out some of the biggest plot lines that we've heard so far in this movie. I mean, it really does tell you storylines of where people end up and why they end up there. I'm not going to get into it because, in my opinion, it spoils too much. If you want to go and find the information online, you can find it. It does, though, however, state that the Resistance base is the planet Dakar, D''Qar. Dakar, not Yavin, as many people suspected. And there's a lot of people I saw that were hemming and hawing online because they're like, wow, here's a forest planet that looks a lot like Yavin, but it's not Yavin. Here's Tatooine, a desert planet that looks a lot like... here's Jakku, that's a desert planet that looks a lot like Tatooine. Why do they keep doing this? Well, first off, you're kind of limited in options. Those can't be the only planets in the entire Star Wars galaxy that have that same type of climate. There are subtle differences. It's just like anything else, though, right? Look, I mean, let me put it this way. I don't care as long as the movie's good. It doesn't matter to me. I trust these individuals, Lawrence Kasdan in this case and J.J. Abrams, to tell us a story that we want to hear, that we want to see, regardless of whether or not they're changing names. And by the way, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have the Resistance base on Yavin when Yavin was the Rebel Resistance base, and surely the Empire, now the First Order that is trying to replicate what the Empire did, would have known, right? It doesn't make any sense. And to have, again, another planet another story start off on Tatooine seems a little redundant. So we'll make it similar. Isolation. We'll make the reason for the planet and why people are there, the battle over Jakku, to give it a sense of, this is a planet that may have been made up of individuals who are scavenging Star Destroyers that took place after the Battle of the Death Star over the Battle of Jakku, right? Now, there were also some complaints, and we're almost done. There are also some complaints about the fact that we essentially have a Death Star 3 in Starkiller Base. And J.J. Abrams has come out and said as much, that this new Starkiller Base is essentially a Death Star 3, but it's much bigger and larger and more dangerous than a Death Star. I'm totally cool with that. And I know there's some people out there complaining, but in terms of, bring it back to real world. You don't see people going and saying, boy, I wish somebody could come up with some other super weapon other than a nuclear bomb, right? I mean, the nuclear bomb, nukes, is still the biggest threat in terms of nations going to war than anything else. I mean, it makes sense. So it would make sense in the Star Wars galaxy that Death Stars would be what else do you build? This one apparently can destroy entire solar systems, and so it's bigger and badder than the other Death Stars. They learned from their mistakes. That makes sense to me. And there was some diagrams that came out in a magazine showing what Starkiller Base is and how it was originally dubbed the Evil Castle, and how it mixes in the technology with some of the landscape of the planet, and it looks awesome, man. Again, I personally can't wait to see this thing in action. All right, one more thing before we're done, and this has me, out of all the news this week and the footage and everything else, this probably has me the most excited. This was an interview with Adam Driver, who plays Kylo Ren. He's not Luke Skywalker. Kylo Ren actor Adam Driver, in the article I have from IGN, recently discussed his role in Star Wars The Force Awakens. When they think of their actions as morally justified, it makes them dangerous and unpredictable, Driver told Empire. There's no level they won't go to accomplish what they are after. I never thought of the character as an evil person. He went on to say that Ren was a religious fanatic rather than your typical evil-minded villain. That has me excited, man, because that to me is the bigger threat, is the bigger evil when you have a character who thinks what they're doing is right. That is wholly more dangerous than the guy that knows what he's doing is wrong. Because how do you go after an enemy that is doing such horrible, heinous things? And I won't apply it to real-world scenarios. If you follow news, you know what I'm talking about. It's not all dissimilar from threats that we're dealing with on a daily basis that, unfortunately, because it's the world we live in, I have to cover on my radio show. But when you think of this, again, as a religious fanatic and somebody who thinks he's morally justified in the horrible action he's taking, I mean, that adds such depth and weight to a villain and makes him a lot more of a formidable opposing character. And from what we hear about the First Order, too, these guys are here to do what the Empire couldn't do. So these stormtroopers can battle against lightsabers, as we've seen in the most recent TV spot. These guys know how to shoot. They are not making the same mistakes as the group that they are trying to emulate. Man, it's going to be a fun 3 weeks leading up to this movie. I can hardly wait. Thanks for hanging out on episode 8 today. I really do appreciate it. As always, go and subscribe on iTunes. Drop a rating on iTunes if you don't mind. That helps to bring the podcast for My Nerd World and Star Wars up in the rankings. I'll be back next week talking to Revenge of the Sith, talking about whatever news comes out between now and then. So until episode 29 and our journey to The Force Awakens, may the Force be with you always.